welcome to Show Studio. It's our final panel of the season, so it's a sad day, but it's also a great day because we're going to be talking about the Alexander McQueen show, and what a great time to be talking about McQueen, because it seems like it's kind of McQueen year in some ways. There's so many amazing things going on, and most notably obviously the amazing Savage Beauty exhibition, which is now coming to the V&A and opening this week, so it's so exciting. So alongside discussing the show and Sarah Burton's latest collection, we are going to talk about that exhibition and fashion exhibitions in general, and the way in which Savage Beauty, when it was on in the Met, changed our view of fashion exhibiting, or if it did at all. We can debate that. We're also going to talk about the role of the individual designer, and I think that's come under the spotlight a lot recently, with all the reportage around McQueen, and you know, what boundaries are appropriate when it comes to how we talk about designers and their individual personalities. Given that, you know, someone like McQueen, he put a lot of himself into his work, so how do you get that balance right? And we'll also obviously talk about McQueen now and Sarah Burton's vision for the house. So lots of amazing stuff to discuss. I've got such an incredibly intelligent panel with me that I'm somewhat intimidated. But before we kick off our very smart discussions, I'll let you guys introduce yourselves, starting with you, Oriole.
I'm Oriole Cullen, and I'm a fashion curator at the Victoria and Albert Museum.
I'm Madeline Levy. I am a fashion journalist and the editor-at-large of Bond magazine, and about as intimidated as you are.
I'm Amy Haye. I'm a dress historian and curator, and I work at London College of Fashion.
And I'm Sonnet Stanfill, also a fashion curator at the Victoria and Albert Museum.
I'm Alison, a curator at the London College of Fashion.
Anything happened here, a disaster of some sort, fashion curating would not be the same again. It's quite worrying. I feel very protective. Well, the first thing I do want to talk about obviously is Savage Beauty, and so it's probably a kind of a silly question that I think has been sort of asked so many times, but why was that exhibition so popular? What about it inspired people? Was it the setup and the amazing design? Was it the fact it replicated McQueen's shows? Was it just the beauty of those clothes? What was it that inspired people?
I think I can only speak from my own personal experience of visiting the show, which was 3 weeks before the close, and it was after the Met had extended the hours, and there was this kind of frenzy in the air about getting to see it. And I think that there was something that happened. It was the combination of what was on show, which of course was spectacular, but also this sense that you had to be a part of it, that you had to go and see it. It wasn't enough just to see photographs or to kind of hear about it word of mouth. So it became an event, a kind of happening that people wanted to be a part of, to say they were there. And it's rare for any kind of museum exhibition, you know, aside from fashion, to create that kind of frenzy, I think.
Yeah, I think you did have that kind of Malcolm Gladwell tipping point. So many people had seen it that everyone else had to see it almost. So I agree with that. I also think that it had, and I can't quite put my finger on what it did, because I also saw it when it was terribly crowded, and yet it did transport you somewhere. It sucked you in, and you almost didn't notice all those other people pushing and shoving and trying to see the same things as you, and just take you somewhere to,
as well,
and that is a rare experience. So yeah, the combination of the tipping point effect.
But it's not a completely new phenomenon, because in 1946, when the V&A staged the Britain Can Make It exhibition, there were crowds, massive crowds outside the museum, so much so that the police had to be called to control them. So it's completely thrilling, but it isn't a completely new phenomenon either.
Do you find that a bit frustrating? Because that's one thing I found interesting, you know, as curators and a journalist, because I think there's been so much reportage around it, as if it kind of, you know, changed fashion exhibiting, and put, you know, a phrase that keeps coming up in a lot of articles, you know, put the fashion exhibition on the map. Do you take issue with that a bit?
I think it was phenomenally successful, and it captured the public imagination, but I mean, fashion curatorship's been a discipline that's been certainly established for 50 or more years. And lots of exhibitions have been hugely popular. The 1971 Beaton exhibition was massively popular, the shows that Diana Vreeland did at the Met. But this somehow caught the imagination, and it obviously broadened the profile of the sort of visitors who would normally go and see a fashion exhibition.
And I think that's very important too. I mean, that is a wonderful thing, that it has brought in people. I mean, it was very interesting hearing the interviews with people in the queue. You know, a lot of people had never been to a fashion exhibition, but as Sonnet said, is that thing that you had to see it. This, you know, that you were saying, that tipping point, that it was something that had to be experienced, and also I think word of mouth did play a big role in this, because the reception when people went to see the show initially, it was pretty quiet.
Yeah,
well,
exactly,
I mean, it was successful from the start, but it wasn't the furore that it became, and I think that definitely people sort of visiting and writing about it, word of mouth definitely sort of changed that, and I think it's obviously, we can say it's a brilliant show.
But it also was an incredible spectacle. The way that it was designed, the garments, everything that you were saying in the beginning, it, I think, was a perfect example of a fantastic fashion exhibition for people who do want to go and experience the kind of work like Alexander McQueen, where they wouldn't have had that access to that at the catwalk. It was a first entry point, I think, into his world. And also an exhibition that happens relatively recently after his death as well. I think it was incredibly emotional for a lot of people that were going around the exhibition that could feel this kind of closeness to him.
And I think that's a very key thing, the team. It was his own team who worked on this show. And so for those people who felt they would never get to see his shows, this was that opportunity to see that team working together. And I think that's something we'll probably discuss later on, but how important that is, that when you become a designer of that stature, he was a brilliant person for choosing very talented people to work with. And you know, his team stuck by him throughout, and I think that's maybe what made it so precious and unusual, that it was all of those creatives coming together.
I think that's interesting in the way that in some parts it was an exhibition, but in some parts, I mean, it wasn't. There weren't catwalk shows there, but it did feel like inviting the public to see a catwalk show in some respects, just because of the way that those, you know, Voss was recreated and that kind of thing. Do you think the curation of it, but also the design of it, the amazing design that Sam Gainsbury and Joseph Bennett did, do you think that will influence other fashion exhibitions? Do you feel it in your practice as something that you're thinking about now?
I think it's a very interesting thing, because obviously Andrew Bolton, you know, created this idea, and he's written about it extensively, and has worked. You know, Claire Wilcoxon's come to the V&A, so there is very much a sort of personal take, and I think Andrew, as we know, has done phenomenally successful shows at the Met. But yeah, it was, you know, initially his vision, and I think that's a very personal thing.
But it was a risk as well, because it could have gone really badly wrong.
Oh, sorry, the show's starting. So sorry, cut everyone off. We'll go back to discussing that, don't worry. I think it's important to note that McQueen haven't streamed their shows for a really long time as well, so it is very interesting that they are streaming, purely because McQueen actually, it sounds like such commonplace to talk about live streaming now. It doesn't sound very romantic, but streaming was something that was part of McQueen's creative vision. You know, obviously he worked with Show Studio and with Nick on Plato's Atlantis and streamed that show, and that really sort of set a precedent, and it became the norm within the industry. So I think it's, you know, now it seems such a common thing, it kind of seems like a corporate thing, but I think to him it was a very creative thing, so I think it is interesting that they've chosen to do it this time. Just singing the praises of streaming, and now we're getting buffering, which is not ideal. Just as we're looking at this, and we'll jump forward a few topics and just talk a little bit about Sarah Burton, because what do we expect from McQueen now? Because I think it is slightly different to what we traditionally look to McQueen for. Do we think she's brought her own imprint to the house? What are her codes?
I think she shares the craftsmanship and the quality of craftsmanship that McQueen had, but it's much softer, more feminine.
She really brings out this sort of beauty that he had in his work, and I think maybe there's less of the morbidity around her collections.
That's interesting. So do you think there's less of the darkness?
I mean, it's definitely something she addresses, but I think generally there isn't that sort of sting in the tail, maybe, that you would feel from his shows.
Yeah, and in general, her shows have also had slightly fewer themes. McQueen shows used to have quite a few layers to them. There would be something very central, but also added. Everything would be mixed up. And I think she has streamlined it slightly.
And I think that's very important because she's sort of being true to her vision of McQueen, and I think that is incredible because she's sort of kept us with her really, but it's her own interpretation of it, which is important. It's not a pastiche of what we did.
Exactly.
And that's a hard thing to achieve.
Yeah,
It's a really hard thing to achieve.
I mean, they do talk so much. I mean, that it is kind of, well, I guess, what your second topic is about the gossip and the people's lives. But it's interesting to see. I mean, all this talk, which is of course true about all the pressure on designers and how difficult it is, and how they kind of use drugs and other ways of intoxication to get away from it. She seems to be managing. I have no idea, but she has a young child, and yet she does amazing things, and I think she seems to have also been able to gap a little bit of the bridge between the catwalk and the brand. So
Which I think
she
was
must
an
be
issue
of
for a
a
while.
strength in her just capacity of work and understanding of brand in the company that's absolutely extraordinary.
No, she's an amazing example of a designer, I think. You're right.
Incredible the way that she stepped up to the challenge, really. I mean, having worked so closely with McQueen and all the conversations that were swirling around in the press at the time about whether the label was going to continue, who was going to head it up, to step forward and so confidently as well take on that
also
role.
that she has the legitimacy of having worked with him for so long that it gives a kind of authenticity and integrity to
It does. She was a natural successor, and she's got gravitas because of that. But she's also avoided the spectacle, hasn't she? She said, well, she doesn't do theatre and the emphasis is upon the clothes. And I wonder if we were to do an exhibition of her clothes, whether we might, Andrew installed an incredibly theatrical spectacle. If subsequently we were to exhibit the clothes she's designed for McQueen, would it be appropriate to exhibit them?
You've stolen my question. I was going to ask if we did a Sarah Burton McQueen exhibition, how would you curate it?
Yeah, would we do it less theatrically? Well, perhaps it would be appropriate. And more in a traditional museum approach where you actually really focus on the clothes.
On the clothes,
Well, I think just looking at the setting here, of course, it is very atmospheric, but it's without that kind of spectacle.
It's without props and
theatre.
But I think there is some kind of subtle, it's not that it's completely bare, it's never just the white space. I mean, this is beautiful, these Gothic arches.
it's in
it's completely choreographed.
And also the McQueen orchids, that so there is these little subtle sort of hints, and which I think are, but the clothing, is beautiful.
It's foregrounded, isn't it? You don't ever lose sight of the clothes.
And the precision is amazing. I mean, it's incredible with her garments.
Just some details on the show. As I said, it's held in a former prison, La Conciergerie. And also, I don't think the music we're getting is probably the soundtrack. That is the bad thing of streaming, is getting music rights, because the music that they're having there is being drowned over by the sound of tweeting birds and rolling waves, which obviously I would presume that's a reference to The Birds, which is one of his most one of his very acclaimed shows, and then also the rolling waves plated Atlantis and that notion of the sea and the models returning to the sea. So I think that's what I find interesting, is how she plays with theatre in very subtle ways.
And the fact that it's a prison too is very interesting. That's the one thing we're precluded from the birds and the sea.
Exactly.
But I think there is that subtle suggestion that they put that in the show notes, and that
it's a funny tension as well between being imprisoned and trapped and her being about liberating women. So there's an interesting tension as well.
And the show almost, it's always difficult to say something straight away, but it almost seems to be exploring the history of punk, the things that punk kind of ripped up. So it's taken quite a few of those tropes. They don't seem to be punky and ripped up here, but you do have quite a few of them brought in.
I find the silhouette quite interesting, because there's less of a focus on, when I think of McQueen, I do think of you think a lot of the hip and the shoulder, and this is very much not about that. It's about things like the neck and the chest and the back and the centre of the back, and I think that's interesting, is how she's even like those.
But that tiered frill, is such a it's a signature, I think, really of her work as well as McQueen, that she does so well. Sorry.
You have the elongated torso, which.
But it's not distorting the feminine figure, is it?
No, it's not.
It's following the lines.
Well, it's back to the earlier point about a sort of softer femininity without. So far, we've seen clothes, beautiful dresses that are without that kind of hard edge, without that kind of frisson of the kind of gothic side, of the darker side.
Yeah.
And an interesting color palette too.
Yeah.
Quite a lot of color that's, bright reds and use of feather, which is always a very McQueen material.
Yeah. I asked them, we interviewed Katie England here recently, I don't want to give too much away because we're going to launch the interview scene about McQueen, and that was one of the things I said, what are the codes of a McQueen look? And it was interesting because there were so many, and that's what I find exciting about him is, you think he had such a specific style, but there are so many different things. You could talk about the shoulders, you could talk about the elongated torso, you could talk about the surfaces, there's so many different things, but she did talk a lot about the feathers, and it's nice to see that here because you think a lot about that. I always think of that when I think of McQueen's work.
And those high necks as well, that really frame the face.
Yeah.
That's quite a few.
Well, there's a lot of history in this. I think it's interesting you were talking about punk because there is always a sense of kind of, British style traditions alongside kind of really sort of ancient history, and how he brings that together I find really interesting.
Also less expected references. I've been looking at the Worth photograph albums in the V&A from about 1914, and the silhouette is in some respects not dissimilar, sort of high Medici collars, structured shoulders.
There's something quite Edwardian about this too.
That's what I think, and also the use of feathers is very Edwardian, and I think it makes me think 1900s as much as any other era.
Yeah, I mean, there's that Moulin Rouge, boudoir kind of colours,
and the
red and the
hairstyle
black.
as well.
Absolutely.
Very of that era.
But there's always something very regal about his work, and I think she's carried that forward but softened it in a way. But you do.
But it's partly it's the posture, isn't it? And
Yeah,
it's the
it
emphasis
is.
on the
It's
neck
the
and
way
the
you
head
have
held
to
high.
walk.
We stand up straight in those kinds.
And it's the exact opposite with their feet as well, isn't it? Because when they're walking, they're sort of at an angle and awkward, but the head is upright and sort of proud and majestic in a way.
Yeah. The casting's always amazing. I think Jess Haddett does such a good job there.
I mean, even the way that the models now walk, I think, on the catwalk is softer than when for Alexander McQueen's catwalks, where they were often stomping down with this real.
Well, they're not characters in the same way, are they? I think they're not playing character. They are characters. There's a character to the show, but they're not acting.
Yeah.
But they almost look Elizabethan, don't they, with that really pale makeup and.
Dawn's makeup.
Or absinthe addicts.
I like the sort of the collars and that sort of very central focus of that line, because there's always something quite, it's kind of a bit fetishistic and it's quite central, but also that notion of being kind of wrapped up or being sort of bound in some way. And we were talking about entrapment before, and I think there's a really interesting, what I'm finding interesting about the show is the sort of the contrast between things that are about the body being sort of entwined and trapped, and then things being very free.
The harness is there. It's again something that again is a sort of quite a McQueen thing, but it's there under the dresses too, which is quite interesting.
But then you think, she recently, when she did the Spring Summer collection, that was sort of the harnesses where they were very, very structured, whereas this is much more fluid. I want to see more of the close-ups. I think that'll give us a really good idea. So as we've looked at that, we did continue talking about the notion of the exhibition. I want to go back to that point about exhibiting Sarah's work, because I think that gives us quite a good way of thinking about the differences between what she does there and what he does there. Do you think it is more about the clothes with her there? That sounds dismissive, as if he didn't pay attention to them, which I don't mean, but I do think it's interesting how she's removed the theatre, or was that just because it would be too impossible to compete?
Or is that because she has a more discreet life, and if you live your life in the spotlight, people are always going to analyse your work in the context of your life lived. Whereas if you live a more discreet life, perhaps the parallels aren't drawn in the same way.
Yeah.
And I think she's in a very different position. He was a very passionate person who established his own brand and ran at it, and you know, they had this very difficult period where he died, and she was sort of thrust into the spotlight. And you could never do everything the exact same, and I think a lot of people have spoken about how important the show was for him. Often it became a sort of starting point and working backwards from that. So I think it's clever in a way that she's not trying to replicate that. But she is saying, I've worked with him on all these garments, I've worked on the design, and you know, that's what she's brilliant at. So I think it fits well.
I think there's an incredible modesty as well, because I mean, she's inherited an incredible mantle, and she could have been very grandiose about it.
But there's also a real confidence behind it as well.
Absolutely.
That it is about the work,
gravitas,
about
but without the personality.
that she isn't trying to put forward this big spectacle that McQueen was doing.
But I think also it's interesting, that notion of how she's let, you know, when we look at it, I find myself going, well, he was always very interested in that, he was always very interested in this, he was passionate about that. You don't find yourself going, well, of course she loves this, because you don't know. And I think that's what's interesting, you know, with the house, and I think that's what's interesting with Savage Beauty, is the pieces you can always pull back to him, whether it's the birds and his love for kind of sitting on the rooftops and watching birds, or whether it's, you know, things to do with his family or things to do with London, his heritage. You can always find a thread that relates to him as a man, and you can't do that with her. I don't know what her passions are, I don't know what her interests are, and I mean, you can read interviews with her and you get an inclination, but like, it's not.
But it is ultimately about the clothes.
It's not about her life.
No.
To a certain extent, it's also adapting to the times, because the best way of getting attention used to be a spectacle. Today, fashion doesn't really work that way. You do need good imagery that can be kind of Instagrammed and that can just be replicated everywhere. Replication is kind of more important than the moment. Even though there's the live stream, it's still the kind of stills, the catwalk stills, that's what gets spread, that's what gets seen. So he did what was the most clever solution for building a brand at the time. I think she does what's the most clever solution for her brand right now.
I wonder if it's a gendered thing as well.
Tell me more about that.
I don't know. I mean, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, but it's a different response. I don't know if it's more of a womanish thing. But then I suppose, and I'm just thinking as I'm speaking, but when lots of designers, they were often promoted as their own best label, like Chanel, for instance. She was the best advocate. But we don't do that with Sarah Burton, do we? We just, the clothes speak for themselves. And they do, they warrant that scrutiny.
That's also, she's got a powerful, I mean, she has perhaps the best kind of celebrity placement that you can in the whole world. I guess you can't.
But she's never involved herself in that. That is
no, but I mean, she kind of has that, she doesn't have to.
She doesn't have to.
She has another person who wears the stuff, and that gets all that, you know.
But a lot of people would be seduced by that. And she isn't. And I think that's extraordinary.
If you look at your point on gender, I think if you look at contemporary women designers, at the moment, I mean, obviously Donatella is fabulous, but in general, the next generation down, it's much quieter profiles.
It's a woman thing.
Well, it's an interesting question. I think, you know, when you think of contemporary designers, it's mostly the men who have a higher profile. So
I also think that for her, the legacy of taking that label forward, it's so connected to her relationship with him, and how you know, difficult, we've spoken about how difficult it must have been for her to take over, but then there has to be some kind of respect for his own legacy, and to kind of try to usurp that, I think just wouldn't be authentic to her or appropriate. So it's not about biography for her, it's about getting to work.
I guess in a way it's about working to a brief, and that explains the slight pragmatism in her work, I think, because, you know, as you say, it was her role to kind of facilitate his dreams and to work on projects that he'd set, and I think you would just continue that, because it would be the way you were used to working in that context. So I think, that is interesting to think about it.
I still think some people would have been completely seduced by the fame and the attention, and couldn't have resisted making more of themselves. And I think it's kind of incredibly charming, and actually that you focus on the clothes.
It's interesting because I do think her appointment set the way for new appointments that are more like that, of people who are more like that as well, and they proved that you could have that kind of personality and sensibility and be in such a major high profile fashion position as that. I think that is interesting. I think, you know, it was obviously a huge responsibility for her, but also I think it was a a brave appointment on their part as well, because
But I think it also is at the forefront of this kind of notion of promoting from within and not doing a search for the known person out there in the universe. But we've seen a lot of that in recent years, of that kind of unknown person behind the curtain that steps forward and takes forward the brand.
But also we've seen what happens when you live your life in the spotlight in the way that McQueen did. You're subject to the most terrible kind of scrutiny.
Yeah, well, that kind of brings us to the point I want to talk about, which is how do you separate that? Because I find that it's been really interesting thinking a lot about McQueen, because we are doing this series on him here at Haye Studio, because he was a designer that put himself into his work. So in some respects you go, well, then he opens himself up for a kind of personal analysis and for people to look at him as a man and not just as a designer. But then you think, that it's...
But how far do you go?
Yeah, exactly.
And
how far
is
do you go?
looking at his intimate private life appropriate? I think not.
But going back to the Savage Beauty exhibition, I think that's also part of its success, was that it was almost walking into his autobiography, because so much of his collaborations with personal friends, their voices came through as well. And I think it's very difficult with historical exhibitions of designers that you can't always get that first-hand voice, and I think that really comes through in the exhibition.
But then it's hard, isn't it? Because how do you get that balance right? Because you want that human aspect, and that's magical, but then how do you kind of protect our creatives? Because it does seem if you pour yourself into your work, then it leaves you exhausted, and it leaves you also open to books about your life and your...
But there's always been books about the designers' lives. I mean, Chanel lived her life in the spotlight, and there were loads of biographies, but we knew who her lover was, but we didn't need to know much more than that.
Yeah.
And
what they've done so well, what Andrew did very well at the Met, and what we've replicated at the V&A with Savage Beauty, is that the biography is connected to the work, and that the biographical details of friendships and collaborations are connected to the work. So there's been some wonderful research done about some of the London creatives that he collaborated with, and some of that will be on the V&A website. But it all comes back to those connections in creating the pieces and creating the shows, and it's not so much about the personal life devoid of that connection.
It's about curatorial integrity as well, isn't it? It's about what's appropriate. And the context of the V&A, which is a design museum, it's exactly appropriate to look at his biography in the context of his designs. And he was a designer. That's what he put in the public domain. He didn't have, I don't think, he didn't open up his private life to be scrutinised in the same way.
It's hard though, isn't it? Because more and more designers, they become like celebrities, and it's how...
But do we do that to them?
Yeah, that's what I was trying to work out. That's kind of why I wanted to talk about this, because you think, in a way, because you think as fashion press, you applaud them and you talk about them as individuals, and in a way, someone like McQueen allowed that to happen by making such amazing personal work, and it's almost like the work was so good and so personal that you became even more fascinated about him as a man. So you talked about him as a man, and then it makes them this star figure. So it's kind of like, how do you protect people?
But is that what we expect and want from our fashion designers? And so, he trained and worked really hard to be a really good designer, and he was a phenomenal designer.
I also wonder about generationally, would we be having this conversation in 10 years' time? Because if you look at a lot of younger designers, emerging designers, their lives are on Instagram. And it's not, you're living in the spotlight, you're living in your own spotlight. So that's a different mindset.
Yeah, that's very true.
Which I think is interesting to look at. Maybe somebody like Olivier Rousteing at Balmain, who is very open about his life, and it's part of his thing, and it's incredibly different. So, just wondering if that will...
Well, it is strange though, isn't it? Because I think we all accept it as the norm with actors, and actors, choose to be actors in the way that designers choose to be designers. They don't choose to be celebrities, but we all kind of think that it's normal that they get the paparazzi following them and that we follow their love lives, and it's strange that we're like, oh, but our designers shouldn't have that, but then we kind of accept it. It's kind of like, what is the qualification to become a celebrity? For a while I think it was being a movie star, but now it seems it's being a designer as well, and it's kind of like, But I
think in the context of so many of us sitting here, I think that our role, our responsibility is, as Amy suggested to have some kind of integrity in how we tell the story, or how what we choose to focus on.
Yeah, I think it
and there's a lot of noise out there,
Yeah.
but if we stay true to the kinds of stories that we tell, within a context of a museum of art and design, the story should be about the fashion design and about the garments. And there's very little actual text about the individual things that people are going to see.
Yeah.
And so really what people will experience and what they would have seen at the Met is the work with a bit of information about it, and they can form their own opinions.
How do we protect our designers though to stop? Because obviously I think, you hope that people will come to see that exhibition and will just think about the work and think about the craft and his design. But it is an ongoing problem, I think, and it's not just something that affects McQueen.
And a lot will come in the wake of those biographies.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But then it's outreach, isn't it? Sorry. But then you get more people coming to the museum.
Yeah, that's the hard
Maybe
thing,
it
isn't
broadens the profile, I don't know.
Yeah.
And also, it's not actually as clear cut. I think two things. McQueen, just look at his Twitter feed. He didn't exactly have that much against inviting people into his private life.
Yeah.
Isabella Blow, very much the same way. Did speak very much. They did share their private lives. It was, so it's not as simple as, it would be others taking on a responsibility of keeping an integrity that actually the people themselves, perhaps, that's a very big responsibility. And I would also like to say, to some extent, I see designers becoming less of celebrities. The big appointments, I've seen more, doesn't say anything about himself or hardly speaks. Christopher Bailey, you have the impression he goes to bed at 9 every night and doesn't do anything except work. A lot of these kind of people who are almost like creative directors, CEOs, you don't actually know that much about them.
But do you think that stops people from connecting with their work in some ways? Do you think what makes people love McQueen is the sense of the man and the flaws and the talents and the brilliant, all of these things? Do you think that's why people identify with it?
No, in general, I don't think that it's actually that necessary. I think there are other things that make a brand, for the wider public, that makes a brand cool. And when it comes to journalists and curators, there are obviously other things than the private life. So in some ways, that designer as celebrity, I'm not quite sure who that is.
I think what I'm trying to work out, and maybe I'm not explaining it right, it's very hard, is how do you get that balance between encourage, because we talk a lot on these panels about fashion becoming, it's less emotional or it's less personal and it feels too corporate. So it's how do you get that balance between encouraging your creatives to, be free in their work and pour themselves into their work and have a license to put themselves into it and put their personality and their passions into it without sort of encouraging them to then become, that kind of, it seems like that gets a bit blurred with them becoming a star designer if you're someone who puts a lot of yourself into it and a lot of your passion. Maybe Raf's actually a really good example because he puts a lot of his personal interests and his work is quite sort of based on his own life and based on, even like the last men's collection references to his school years and stuff. So maybe it is possible to do. So I kind of answered my own question there. Brilliant sharing skills. But I think I just find that interesting with and why there is this kind of obsession. The books that have come out, like the Dana Thomas one particularly, like why are people so interested in designers as celebrities? Is it just because it's salacious?
Well, I think as Amy said, there's always been that interest in anyone in sort of the public life when you think of sort of gossip columns in newspapers, and so I think it's just the fact that they are in the spotlight maybe that draws
people in.
And also they have, it goes back, centuries, but they have clients that are very high profile, and those clothes are worn in the public eye, and so when they're reported upon, then the designer's name comes up. So it's this kind of virtuous or not circle of notoriety, but it's a decades old tradition.
And it should be said, Dana Thomas's book is not that salacious. If you compare it to Andrew Wilson's book, it's more or less the same quotes. They've interviewed the same people. She got all the flack somehow for doing the gossipy book. I think because she doesn't focus that much on the creative output, she puts it more in a perspective of the development of economics and finance, and how fashion has become kind of at the like a center point, not in culture but in the world of finance. It's easier to attack her. Andrew Wilson's book does a psychological portrait, but really he goes just as far in kind of digging out, I don't know, the prostitutes and whoever McQueen would be seeing. But his focus is on, well, the shows and, well, yeah, the psychology. Like, that's what it is.
I just wonder, I looked at what other books they'd written, and I can't remember now, but I remember I thought that they might be much lighter, and the books that they've both written are actually quite serious.
Yeah, Dennis was really a brilliant book
and
about
really
the
quite
Hamburg
good
industry.
biographies,
Amazing
absolutely. And then it made me just wonder whether there's an attitude perhaps that because it's fashion, you can just go perhaps to places that you wouldn't otherwise go.
But do you think that is the link between fashion and celebrity culture? You know, it just purely things like celebrities wearing a lot of fashion, and then designers become friends with the celebrities. You know, it makes it easier to kind of.
But the Patricia Highsmith biography works in the same way. It goes very deep in understanding the psychology in order to understand the output. That's Andrew Wilson's previous book. He tries to look at the history of. I mean, again, I don't in any way defend gossip. About fashion or fashion journalism moving into becoming gossip journalism. But even that, at the end of his life, I mean, the whole L'Œuvre sans père, like the book that is somehow cut off from the person who wrote it, he did kind of revisit that and say that somehow maybe you do need the kind of keys to the work by looking at the life of the author.
I just look, when you think historically, I think I've been collecting like designers' biographies and autobiographies, and there are really wonderful books from the 1950s like Hardy Aim is just so far, and he writes, and it's an amazing insight into the industry and his life and his profession. And when other people wrote about lots of those designers, they always described them as bachelors, which was a euphemism for a gay man, and it was completely accepted, but it never went into their private lives, yet they mixed with the Queen, they mixed with the same sort of high-profile clients, but there was a certain sort of almost good manners where people didn't go as far.
It's really interesting that you say the phrase good manners, because is that part of the problem, that fashion has just become too fast and too popular, and it's kind of like nothing's off limits?
I don't think it's fashion, I think it's the media and certain sorts of media like celebrity magazines, and the difference here is that where certain celebrities invite those magazines into their life and get paid a huge amount of money, Alexander McQueen is dead. He hasn't chosen to do that. He didn't open his life to people in quite that way, to that degree. And so, I don't think it's appropriate, but that's personal. But it's completely different. If you sell your story, it's up to you. But he didn't do that.
But do you think that, despite the fact that he didn't do that people are fascinated by him because of the spectacle of his shows, and because of, at the beginning of his career, the sort of controversy around his work, and how, when you read people talking about being at his shows, that people say that they felt uncomfortable, they felt nervous or uneasy.
I think it's a terrible sort of voyeurism.
I'm not saying that I agree with it, but I'm just saying that people are probably fascinated by that.
We're fascinated. It brings out the worst in us. Of course, we've read it and we're all intrigued to know, but then you read it.
I should say I haven't actually read either of them, so I feel a bit
do I actually want that information in my head?
Yeah.
And actually I don't. I would rather have the information of going to the exhibition and
looking at
what I experience and what touches me emotionally.
Yeah.
But who do you think the target audience is for those kind of books?
Well,
I don't think they're fashion historians or industry experts. I think there's a huge mass audience out there who don't have access to, going to these catwalk shows, who don't have access to the industry, and this is one way of penetrating the industry.
Yeah, and it's living your life vicariously. It's living it through perceptions of other people's. And I mean, I think some people have criticised, saying, well, these writers never met them, but traditionally, and certainly historical biographers, you didn't meet your subject, and actually not meeting them was supposed to give you some sort of critical distance.
But is it all part of a general problem then, perhaps, of kind of like, I don't know, are we seeing a slight sort of dumbing down of fashion reportage? Do we see more, because you even notice it in magazines that are fashion magazines, the way they will talk about the designers, it's kind of asking them kind of quite cheeky personal question. It's less about the work, and it's increasingly it is about people as...
I just think there's a massive interest, and there's a lot of incredibly rigorous work, and there's a lot of sort of scholarly work, and then there's all sorts of other work, and it's horses for courses. There's a massive, massive interest in fashion. There's a massive interest in fashion exhibitions.
But then how do we harness that massive interest in fashion that is going to sell things like those books and get people coming into things like exhibitions, or get people reading about the craft and the cloth and the
we
techniques?
Can't impose. People have to make their choices, don't they?
Well, and there's a lot of variety of fashion exhibitions out there
Exactly.
as well,
Yeah.
which you know, there are some that are scholarly and some that are not, and they're, you know, just because something's in a museum doesn't automatically guarantee that it's going to be good. So I think that's an important point to make as well.
Yeah,
that,
that's...
there's a variety of approaches.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and in some ways, I mean, it doesn't seem fashion is at this. Really, it's taken centre stage within the cultural landscape.
Yeah.
It is there, I would say. I think there are other things now. I think there are other problems with that. I think the relationship between young women and models, for example, is quite... I mean, that's somewhere where we need to work on the kind of relationship between the general public and fashion. That they will read a book too much about... I can't even remember any funny detail now to bring up from the McQueen books, but that they know slightly too much about McQueen. I don't see that as a problem.
I think it's less about sort of whether it's more like how do you... I think we can all sort of see that there's a mass popular interest in fashion, but it's how do you get it to the point where people want to engage with... Because I still think if you asked a lot of members of the public about sort of specific collections, and I'm not saying everyone should be like as obsessive as I am, but then it's like, how do you get them to kind of, engage with that side of fashion? You know, the things that we all speak passionately about and we love, like things like the craft or the techniques, or you know, the narratives. How do you get it beyond it being an extension of celebrity culture and into people admiring it as an art form?
You do an exhibition like Andrew Bolton did at the Met.
Done.
I think people will seek it out if they're interested, and I think you can't impose it on people, but you know, if people are passionate and interested, they will find a way. So I don't think that, from a museum's point of view, that we should feel that we, we should feel that we're there and we're accessible to anyone who wants to come in, but it shouldn't be that everybody must come. So I think that is really... because
we're all about storytelling, whether we're coming at fashion through a journalism prism or through the prism of objects in a museum. We're telling a story, and I think if the story that we tell can engage the public through information that they wouldn't have otherwise, this notion of going behind the scenes of a designer's atelier, or how they sourced materials, or how they collaborated with someone to create something. Those are stories that are not in the gossip magazines. Those are stories that are not in the salacious biographies, and that gives us, I guess, not an edge, but it's something that sets the stories that we tell apart from those.
You should be touched when you go to a museum. You should go and you should be emotionally moved in some way, and you should get an experience that you don't get in your everyday life. And yes, we can be thrilled buying a new dress, but it's a different sort of response. And I think as curators, it's our role to do that, to touch people on some level, and so that you come outside and you feel altered in some way. And if we don't do that, there's no reason for people to go to museums.
It's just, I ask because I just wonder if it has affected, most... we talk a lot on these panels about kind of how fashionable it is to like fashion, and that must have in some ways affected your practice, just in being aware that perhaps it is, like you were saying, you will get people through the doors of a fashion exhibition who 5 years ago perhaps wouldn't have visited one. And how do you get that balance right between never wanting to sort of, for want of a better phrase, dumb down anything or making it mass, but how do you get that balance right between trying to encourage people to come and see it and encourage people who know nothing about fashion to enjoy an exhibition, without kind of doing things that just cater to the common denominator.
It is such a delicate balance.
Yeah.
And, you know, with a national museum, the pressure on visitor figures, to get visitor figures, is very, very real.
But it is on regional museums too. I mean, massive
Absolutely.
pressure.
But there are some museums out there that do not have that pressure. There are few, but that they can be freer to program how they want. And so we are not completely free of that pressure. So we have to be mindful that, you know, a museum like the V&A and other museums do work under this constant concern.
But it's also about disseminating it in different ways as well. And I think education departments play a big role, don't they? So at the V&A or at Brighton Museum or wherever, you will have people who are really good at facilitating a narrative for children, people that will facilitate a narrative that perhaps is intergenerational, that will appeal to design students. And so I think the curator tells a story, and then, you know, you can draw out different areas.
And what's also been really exciting over the last decade has been the ability to tell that story online, and more curators are having to think of the web presence as not just a complement, but as a kind of separate entity in some ways. And that is so exciting. It's a way of reaching people around the world, and it sounds so obvious now, but that's happened since I joined the V&A. That's been an experience of change in the way that we practice our work.
And it's inclusive for all the people, for various reasons, for cultural or religious or disability reasons, can't get to the museum. It makes the museum accessible and relevant to everyone.
But I think there is that point that you were saying, that really we have to be mindful of balancing spectacle with, you know, with the sort of something that is really has integrity, and you know, and I think that, as Sonnet was saying, there is this pressure to get people through the doors, and that I think weighs quite heavily. And I think there, you know, you have two different sides now that you really have to balance.
Yeah.
And we talk about spectacle, and we all feel we know it, but we don't actually define it. And sort of, you know, what is spectacle? What is spectacle in a fashion exhibition? Is it a staggering installation design?
It used to be a bit of film.
I remember the days.
And now
it's complex now.
It's all stage sets.
But I think it's that you don't overwhelm the content, basically, you know, with the all singing, all dancing, you know, that you go down the route of a theme park almost. That's what, which...
And we are getting the same industry professionals working in the context of the museum and on the catwalk, and that's quite a new development. And in some ways, bringing some zip to the museum is an amazing thing, and certainly makes it more appealing. But in the way that I think in the past the V&A would pull in some good window sort of display artists from Regent Street to help display an exhibition, now it's very much the same people who are producing the shows who are coming into the context of the museum.
Sam Gainsbury and Joseph Bennett.
Exactly.
And, you know,
I think there is now, I have to say that I think that the big accomplishment for the Met in staging this show was to simply raise the bar. You know, raise the bar for all of us, because of the elaborateness of the build, because of the attention to detail, because of the film, because of so many elements, and it all together as a package. I think, rather than saying, oh, it was the most this or the most that, I think it's just the fact that it made it more challenging for those that follow, because this is a project that, even if you weren't necessarily interested in fashion, but you lived in New York, that people went. And so that's what people talk about now.
it's almost like an invitation to try new things. And
Exactly. What comes next?
I think it really depends on the venue and the audience that you're trying to reach. And I think what's interesting in terms of the evolution of fashion curation is that there are curators who are working not necessarily within the traditional museum context, who are looking at more experimental ways of talking about dress. And I think that, you know, there really has to be this spectrum of exhibitions. You know, in Savage Beauty, it's an incredible spectacle, also hugely expensive. And you know, to continue to produce work like that, I think it really works within the context of the designer that you're representing. I think it was natural that it was going to be this spectacle to represent McQueen. And as we discussed, would you do the same with Sarah Burton? And I don't think it means that every exhibition now has to follow this blueprint of it being this incredible set. And I think, you know, looking at just like the Fashion Space Gallery at the London College of Fashion, in terms of looking at scale, you know, a very small gallery space, but that allows Gaia Salazar, the director of the space, to be really experimental in the work that she commissions. With the work of people like Simon Costin, where he had this experimental exhibition made from cardboard. I mean, the complete extreme and antithesis.
But also don't lose track of all those completely amazing museums, and they're not all about dress, but that are quirky regional museums in little towns up and down the country. I think I went to one in Stenning the other day, and sort of on the south coast. And they're often run by volunteers, and they're not necessarily slick and polished, but actually there's something completely extraordinary about them that also touches you because they're embedded in the community, and they serve different purposes, but they're no less valid.
I was going to ask that, is there a worry sometimes as well that kind of the blockbuster fashion exhibition then lessens the appeal of something like that?
I think it's a broad field, and the more that happens, the better.
Another thing I wanted to ask about, and I do want to look again at Sarah Burton's collection, but this is fascinating, is what do you think about the blurring between the curating and the fashion exhibition kind of moving into a retail context? Because we're seeing that more and more, and I find that quite interesting. You know, the Harrods did the Prada Sphere, which was that big Prada exhibition. Is it exciting for you guys to see kind of the exhibition moved into a context where people who are, you know, shopping might see it, or is that quite dangerous territory?
I think it's interesting because in Japan, a lot of the galleries are actually in shopping centres. And that's something we know from the touring shows and things, that is a sort of natural centre for it. And I think that is interesting because you do get another audience coming in and engaging with it. So, and I think places like the Bon Marché in Paris, they're very good at putting on exhibitions there, fashion related, during Fashion Week and things. So I don't think it's necessarily, you know, it's something to be worried about. I think the more accessible, the better.
And again, there's historical precedents, aren't there? I mean, the V&A got one of its best dress collections, the Robert Hughes collection from Harrods. Acquired this massive collection of an artist's clothes, exhibited them in 1913, and then gave them to the V&A. It's one of the best collections. So I mean, it works both ways as well. It's not only the museum going to the retail environment in that instance. It was the retail environment that had the money to acquire it and gave it to the V&A.
I know nothing about this, so sorry if this is a mind-blowingly stupid question. But do you museums have relationships with retailers? Would you ever have a case where you say, if your stock isn't sold, can we look at it and choose pieces to go into archive, especially now that shops are often buying showpieces?
Well, I think if they didn't sell, we'd have to look carefully at why. But the V&A doesn't have a kind of standing relationship like that. But I think that possibly if you think about some of the other examples of long-standing acquisition policies, perhaps the Fashion Museum in Bath, their Dress of the Year, it's not a long-standing relationship with a retailer, but it's this tradition of having a journalist choose what, you know, and I think that works really successfully. I mean, I think that retail buyers are a really interesting category because of career kind of sphere, because they're a filter of taste, but they're one filter of taste rather than the kind of rainbow of what's out there. And so I think that the role of curator is to try to sift through all of those different options and to choose dispassionately. And I think choosing through a retailer would be perhaps one-sided. I don't know if other people have.
I think we can't choose dispassionately.
Yes. But you know, with curating as well, you can't help but let your personal side come through. And there are, you know, particular exhibitions that I will always sort of work on, and others that I would never, because. So I think it's very difficult to. Your judgment is always going to be informed.
And you could look at the V&A's collection and look at how the curators who've come, and the collection is certainly shaped by their preoccupations, however much our emphasis was always upon or design that leads. Of course, the choice of exhibitions and what we collect, it reflects our personal preoccupations. So you've done like all the work on Italian fashion and American fashion.
And there are quite a few Italian garments now in the V&A's collection.
Yeah, and I did the street style exhibition. An Oriole liked hats and
Like Alcoholics Anonymous, you're like, I'm Oriole.
Can I ask you something?
We always, whenever Oriole and I are on camera together, I always end up making her out like to be like a mad hat obsessive, like truly mad, and I can only apologise for it.
There's no photos. Oh, anyway.
I have a question. I guess it doesn't really concern the V&A because that's got a specific status, but since fashion exhibitions do draw crowds in general, do you think that, well, fashion curators somehow get that role of being, oh, you draw the crowds and then we can do our difficult art exhibitions or other things? I mean, not at the V&A, of course, but maybe in other museum contexts. Where the fashion curator is somehow
Depends on the director of the museum.
You make us popular and then
Oh, there are certainly museums that do fashion exhibitions to bring in the sponsorship, and then that it becomes.
Because that is something that I think I've spoken to a few of you about this before, but that is something that is always tricky as well with doing an exhibition that is so about a brand, isn't it? Especially a brand that's still kind of like, because that gets you into really tricky territory where people kind of can make all these accusations about it not being in part. Have you had any comments about that with McQueen?
No, I think the museum is quite open that we have corporate partnerships, and that's all quite transparent. You know, and obviously we couldn't do these shows without these sponsorships, but it's very open. I don't think that we're hiding anything with it. So I think it's.
And we wouldn't have the same debate with fine art or
Exactly,
ceramics or.
Yeah.
That's what I wanted you to say.
And also because Savage Beauty is very, Plato's Atlantis is the last collection shown, so it's not representing the brand today. So it's a very kind of discrete, finite project.
Should we have another look at Sarah Burton's collection? It's interesting you mentioned Plato's Atlantis, because obviously that was the last collection that he did to sort of fully, and now it is her era, and we've talked a bit about the new clothes that she's brought in, but it's nice to look a bit closer and see how she's. I think that's an interesting, the opening looks of the show I think I found very interesting, because they were almost relatively pared back and kind of free from any structure or embellishment. There's a real simplicity to it.
And quite cubisty handbag accessories.
What do we think that material is? The black?
Is that stamped leather?
Yeah.
I think it's stamped leather.
It's interesting to see the gloves that we saw again earlier at Prada. Those kind of high gloves.
I don't know why they're so having a moment. When we look at this, I think this is a hard question. I imagine that you've been looking at all of McQueen's different collections because they're in the V&A, but do you look at it and do you see different collections coming through in it?
Well, you definitely see the signature. I mean, with this, the black dress here, that high collar, the elongated body, and that tiered skirt, and then the sleeves on this sort of coat beside it, these trapped sleeves again. That's.
I think the kimono style of those sleeves is interesting, because I think you tend to think of them as very fitted, but I was talking to Katie England about this, is how some collections have become so iconic and so popular, things like Voss, that actually often I think people think about. We talked about how his narrative has become changed as he becomes more and more celebrated and more famous, and then even to the extent that you talk about design signatures that perhaps weren't necessarily the major signatures at the time, but have become so because certain shows are so popular that you forget other aspects of his work or other things that he was passionate about.
And the Japanese.
Exactly. I think that has happened a bit.
Yeah, and I think in recent collections, Sarah Burton has really transformed that in quite a modern way.
Yeah.
It's quite beautiful.
Well, it's interesting because I was talking to, I think if you look at some, I guess, younger journalists or people who perhaps aren't as aware of the history of the brand, they will talk about that like that's a very new thing, when actually that was a major code. And I think that's interesting how we see McQueen and how history has painted his signatures purely through the popularity of certain collections. I find the harness detail, the way it's almost like she's taken real elements from that harness collection and kind of like turned them inside out and changed them slightly. I think that's interesting.
But you were saying Elizabethan, Amy, and that sort of cut and slash on that bodice is really interesting too. So.
But then it's that notion of clothing as armour, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's almost like a Tudor rose.
Mm.
Do we like what we're seeing?
Yeah, I think it's very identifiably McQueen. I think, and I think that's what Sarah Burton is so brilliant at doing. If you saw these garments stand alone, there wouldn't be any question about who the designer was. I think. So. And that's hard now, you know, because also I think the landscape has changed so much since McQueen started, and it's very difficult to have an individual signature now.
Yeah, it really is. And I think complex signatures are harder as well. It's harder to have kind of the subtleties and the kind of like the oddities that underpin the McQueen aesthetic. Those like the little weird touches and the odd inspirations. It's really hard to do that now. I think, as you say, when you see so many different bits of fashion, it's hard to do anything that's subtle. Everyone's trying to shout, and I think she's very good at doing that.
I like the rippled lace. It's almost sort of aquatic.
Yeah. But there's something I always think, when you see it, you always think, with McQueen clothes, there's always an element where they look like they've been half made and half kind of grown. You know,
exactly.
Like,
it's organic.
Yeah, exactly. And I think she's really good at doing that. You know, they always look like they kind of fell off a tree or blossomed out the ground, and I think that's really amazing.
And the scale, the extreme of the scale is really appealing as well.
And also the subtlety of colour in that rose, just those touches of pink and how it's together.
Those are really beautiful, I think 24 and 25. Now all I can think about is the Sarah Burton McQueen exhibition. I really want someone to do it. Amy, you're going to have to follow through and curate it, otherwise I'll feel very let down. Do you think I think it must be sort of an amazing time for the McQueen brand, but also kind of a hard time because so much focus on him as a man, when, you know, it is a very living, real brand, when to have so much focus on the history of the house almost while you're still trying to keep it going. I think, you know, when I was asking about doing exhibitions about designers or brands that are kind of very much still alive and still going, that's part of the complexity in a way, isn't it?
It is, because Andrew took a big risk. I mean, he did it spectacularly well, but it also could have gone really badly wrong.
Yeah.
Spectacularly wrong.
Yeah.
And you're putting yourself on the line doing that.
But I think also it makes a nice separation too, and I think that's important.
That's really good.
I agree.
Do you mean between
his
work and
Sarah Burton? And I think that, you know, that it was such a shock, and it actually, the exhibition, you know, brought everything together and gave a sort of a focus and a sort of end point, as you were saying, you know, the show ends, Savage Beauty ends with Pleasures Atlantis. And so in a way, for Sarah Burton, that is something, it's an entity that's ongoing. It was at the Met, it's now at the V&A. So I think it gives a good separation between her work now and
it sounds
his.
very sad, but it establishes it as part of fashion history.
Yeah.
You know, and obviously there's an incredible sadness to that, but it puts him as part of fashion history.
Yeah.
And that's wonderful, but...
Yeah, which I think many designers who come in to houses to take over don't have that separation in a way, and they're constantly sort of, you know, which makes it harder, I'm sure, to sort of establish your own signature.
Also, the V&A's not just taken the exhibition as it is, have they? Claire's added a big London section.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, it's certainly an amplified version, and the Cabinet of Curiosities section that was at the Met has been supersized, so sort of the 6 meter high wall space has been used to its full capacity. So it does feel that there is this additional. And
there's a big London section.
And there's a big London section talking about his early work that wasn't at the Met. So
it's a much bigger exhibition, isn't it?
It is bigger. Yeah. It's interesting.
So
I think Claire Wilcox said there's something like another 60 or more mannequins, which is extraordinary, because that's the size of some exhibitions.
Yeah.
Yes, it's the biggest fashion exhibition that the V&A has ever done.
Is it? I can't wait to see it.
You
both must have had glimpses.
I have had glimpses. We have. Yes.
I can't wait.
I can't wait to go. I'm going tomorrow.
Yeah, me too. I can't wait. I'm so excited.
But I think your question was perhaps slightly the way that the conversation gravitated towards the exhibition rather than the show.
Yeah.
It does say something. Yes, it can't be
easy to relate to that, working for the brand at the moment, of course. Maybe, I think for Sarah Burton personally, maybe less because she was so much a part of that.
And as we said, she doesn't seem
for
to
others who
have
have kind of, started working for McQueen in later years. It must be.
I think it is strange because you think, every piece of press around McQueen that you're seeing at the moment is all to do with the old McQueen. It's all to do with the history of the brand. And I just think it's interesting to think about that as, kind of just thinking about fashion reportage and everyone, there's such a focus on the new and kind of, what's next and the latest thing, and to be a brand that's still very much alive and going, trying to sell product and operate as a commercial entity when everything is about kind of the history. It's interesting to see that.
I think that'll pass. I think, this is an exciting moment for the V&A and for the House of McQueen because of the exhibition coming from New York to London. But if we're looking at some of these amazing images of the collection, and they're offering so much choice. They're offering beautiful silhouettes. There's there's evening wear, there's cocktail, there's trousers, there's a wardrobe of choice that comes from a really creative point of view. And so we're having this conversation in the context of the exhibition opening in a few days, but by the time we meet again next season, I think that the work certainly it speaks for itself, and it holds up to scrutiny.
And it speaks to the people who will buy it and wear it and feel confident in it, which is there's that life outside the exhibition.
It's hard to imagine.
It's hard for us.
But also, I think what's interesting about the exhibition coming to the V&A is that there are so many satellite exhibitions that are happening around London as well, to coincide with it. And I wasn't aware that there were so many satellite exhibitions, if any, when it was in New York.
But I think that goes down to the fact they didn't expect it to be a major success,
And then it was pulled together very quickly.
Really quickly,
under very difficult circumstances.
No, it is amazing. It's like London McQueen takeover. It's quite wonderful. I think it sounds a bit but it makes you really proud to work in fashion because everyone's so excited by it, and just to hear my friends, people who aren't interested in fashion, talk about how excited they are to go. It's how magical it's so exciting, because usually I think everyone who works in fashion spends a lot of time defending fashion a lot of the time.
But it's interesting because you say how proud you feel, and I feel like that about the exhibition, but then with a whole different swathe of people, if they were to associate you with those two biographies, would you feel so proud? Because I wouldn't.
No, I wouldn't, but then I kind of love the idea that they'll go and they will stand in front of the wooden legs made for Amy Mullins, or they will stand in front of Plato Sonnet, and they will just look at it. And
but we're proud by proud of the good product.
Yeah. That's why we need to get everyone going to fashion exhibitions and make everyone stop reading books. I think that's the takeaway I want. But I think we should give Sarah Burton a massive round of applause, but also I know Claire obviously is fine, but the V&A a big round of applause because San Francisco's going to be amazing. I'm so excited. So it's a nice note to end on. Should we give her a clap?